email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with Craig Weber, founder of the Weber Consulting Group and author of Conversational Capacity, the secret to building successful teams that perform when the pressure is on. We pick up the conversation with Craig discussing the role conversational capacity can play in politics and political discourse.
If you look at really political discourse, is really a set of conversations about what should our community or what should our state or what should our country look like? What's a good country? What's a good state? What's a good community? And people have very strongly differing opinions about that. And so I think because it's something important, because people are passionate about it, and because they don't see it the same way, that is a set of conversations that are almost primed to go sideways. And so I think it's one of those examples where right in the situations where you need the highest conversational capacity, you often see the lowest because people care. They're smart. They see things in different ways. And suddenly the conversations get very defensive and people either avoid them altogether. They're out of the sweet spot, minimizing and not even bringing it up. Or they go the other direction. They're out of the sweet spot. It's all candor, no curiosity. They're in win mode and they're really going off on each other. And it's very hard sometimes to find any political discourse that's somewhere in the middle. So yes, I've been doing work in some U.S. states, helping Republicans and Democrats learn to engage in policy debate. They're still debating policy with a focus on learning. I'm not asking them to agree with each other. That may not even be possible. But I'm saying if you're trying to make smart policy decisions on behalf of the people you represent, what if that person across the aisle with a very differing framework, different view of what a good state, good country, good community looks like, might help you learn something about the issue you're trying to address, or the problem you're trying to solve, or the issue you're trying to fix. So I regularly hear legislators say, I actually never thought of it that way. And suddenly they're talking to each other a little more, not to agree, but to learn. And that takes some of the pressure out. If I feel like I have to talk to you and we're going to have to agree, that could be really problematic. But no, I'm just trying to learn about the issue. And I've done work there at Georgia State University in Atlanta for a number of years, focused on healthcare issues, which can be quite contentious. But we actually see legislators coming back for more and more and more practice. They're finding value in this.
Who knows? Maybe it ends up being a Venn diagram where something does overlap and there is some common ground.
Very often that is exactly the case. And so let's look for the places where there's some overlap and do some good work there, and then see if that helps us start expanding, that space where there's some overlap, right? So, yeah. The other thing is I work with a good colleague who lives there in Atlanta, Chris Soderquist, systems thinking expert. And Chris, he works with them as well. So we're helping them use things like trend graphs, stock flow diagrams to kind of think about problems, and then coupling that with higher conversational capacity. And one thing we find is if you've got them focused on conversational capacity and working in the sweet spot, and they're using a systems map to kind of work the problem, as I joke around and say, you often see Chris working with a group and suddenly they're pointing fingers at the problem and they're not pointing fingers at each other. When that's a much better place to operate, much less giving each other the finger, right? So there's a lot more constructive dialogue because they're actually pointing fingers at the problem. What about this? What about this? Have you considered this? How does this affect this? So you get them thinking in a more operational way about the problem, and at the same time give them a set of skills for engaging in more balanced conversation. Even people with strongly differing views and big personalities can engage really tough issues in a far more constructive way.
You're a great storyteller, and I love the stories, and the book was chock full of them. I really like the one about what you call the human flamethrower. And you said he treated his perspective as truth. How did you get into change?
Yeah, it's funny. He just reached out to me on LinkedIn here the other day, so we keep in touch. So this is a gentleman who I went to work with a team. It was not doing well, so it was remedial. And it turns out he was raised by a couple of trial lawyers, and so he was trained basically at his dinner table to argue. He said every night at dinner was, argue. And we'd find some issue and just go at it. And I thought that was normal until I got to the age where I brought friends home for dinner. And he said, man, they would leave with PTSD, completely shell-shocked by my family. Well, he spent 20 years in that environment. And when he went to work he didn't leave all that training behind. And so he was on an international cross-functional team. And he was just coming in like Miley Cyrus swinging in on a wrecking ball, just causing all kinds of trouble. He wasn't a bad guy. Even the colleagues I interviewed who were struggling with him loved him. Now, we love this guy, but boy, he's real difficult. But I think what got him to change, what got him to start getting better at reining in his win tendency and engaging people in a more balanced way, is he saw the price it was, what it was costing him to behave that way. He wanted to be on a high-performing team. His team was one of the worst performing in the organization, partly because of his behavior and the effect it was having on his colleagues' ability to bring their best ideas to the table. So when I'm coaching someone or I'm helping someone try to learn to adjust their behavior, that's one of the things we talk about is what is the current way you operate costing you in terms of performance? And usually that's in terms of influence. My ideas are getting less traction because every time I open my mouth, people roll their eyes and go, here he goes again. But it's also not just influence, it's often reputation. And so when people begin to realize they're paying a pretty severe price for this pattern of behavior they're locked in, they're often motivated to put in the effort to adjust their behavior. Their tendencies haven't gone away. He will always have grown up trained by lawyers. He will always have a strong win tendency, but he's better and better and better at reining it in and not letting it get in the way of his effectiveness under pressure.
Not everybody can do that. I'm glad that he was able to recognize and want to get better, because I think some people are quite happy where they're in their space and they're not going to change.
Yeah, exactly right. So I do find that in some teams where you get people who just are unwilling to do the work. If the team can't handle my candor, it's their problem. Why are you talking to me? And I think I'll joke around when I'm working with CEO or executive teams and say, sometimes you realize you have someone on your team you really want working for your competition.
I'm curious. I know we've been in a remote environment for quite some time, and there's been this, move back to the office, and there's conversations around whether it's going to happen or not. But does working remotely, does that make it easier to fall off your sweet spot?
Yeah, that comes up a lot, especially, during and since the pandemic. I think it does. It's a lot easier to disengage in a virtual meeting, let's say. You have no idea if I'm on mute doing the New York Times crossword puzzle during the meeting. And so I think what can help, higher conversational capacity helps with that problem. Because if I'm in your meeting, Clint, and I know of any time, you're going to get curious and say, hey, Craig, what's your take on what we've been exploring here? You tend to have a different set of experiences than most of us, so I'd love to get your view on what we should do. I'm sorry, what? I was doing a crossword puzzle. Can you repeat the question? That'll happen once. Or if I know at any point in the conversation, you're likely to say, hey, Craig, I just put my view on the table and kind of gave you a little background. What's your reaction to the idea here? Do you see something I'm missing? What? So it makes it risky for people to disengage in a virtual meeting where it's easier to do when there's high curiosity, because people are not just sitting back passively waiting for their colleagues to chime in. They're inviting them in. They're eager to learn from other people. And so that makes it hard for people to, not pay attention, because I know at any point in the conversation, someone's likely to solicit my perspective.
Yeah, that's why when you teach classes, face-to-face is always better, because you can look at the person who's not paying attention and ask them a question. It's harder to do when everybody's camera's off and they're on mute,
Yeah, and that's often a ground rule, when I do work with clients is cameras on, right? Someone once said, and I like this, being in a Zoom meeting with your camera off is like being in a regular meeting with a bag over your head.
I like that.
Right?
Unfortunately, some people don't care.
Yes. So I often the ground rule is cameras on. It's about communication. That's why we're in this meeting. And a big part of communication is visual. It's not just what you're hearing. And so, you're actually, I think a basic ground rule should be cameras on unless there's a really good reason not to have it on. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's one of our rules as well. But unfortunately, you get my internet's bad today, blah, blah, blah. So
right.
I'm not going to fix any of that.
And that happens from time to time, but it becomes a pattern. Then I'd want to maybe address it.
Yeah. So I got a couple of project related questions for you now. One is, in the project work that we do, our internal customer is usually somebody who's pretty senior in the organization. And having them in our meetings, especially at the beginning of the project, when we're trying to define our scope and our objectives, which is basically what we're going to do and why we're doing it, that could be problematic. And during this meeting which we call a charter session, we want the team members to be able to speak openly and honestly about the issues. And what we found is nothing squelches that conversation faster than having the senior VP in the room, who everybody knows this project is their idea. So how do we fix that?
Yeah, that's a great question.
If they insist on being in the room, how do we get around that?
That's a key idea in the work I do, is nothing lowers conversational capacity more predictably than the presence of authority. And so if there is what they call in aviation a power gradient in the relationship, trouble starts. People in the junior role, people in the co-pilot seat have a harder time speaking up. So that's a real challenge. So one of the things we talk about with leadership is I need to learn to carry my authority in a way that lifts rather than lowers the conversational capacity of my team. And that takes a lot of work. So the more senior your role, the higher the conversational capacity you need to perform that role well. And so I've said a number of ways you can manage that problem. I watched an executive one time put an idea on the table, explain it to his group, and said, look, you know me, I never make it easy for anyone to challenge me. So break into pairs for 15 minutes. And in 15 minutes from each pair, I want to hear one thing you like about what I just suggested. More importantly, I'd love to hear two things you don't. So, first off, everyone in the meeting now is actively engaged because they're in pairs. Love the acknowledgement up front, but I also like the emphasis on the negative. One thing you like, two things you don't. So there's really working hard to make it difficult for people not to tell him what he needs to hear, even if he is the boss. Another executive I have, and this is one of the more popular examples, is the executive who put an idea on the table, explained and said, look, I'm going to leave the room for 30 minutes. When I come back in half an hour, let's have at least 3 concerns up on the board and we'll work them through together. So he actually got up and left the meeting for a while. So still a participant in the meeting. They need to be there to listen, to hear, but they're also spending some time out of the meeting, giving them that space where their candor is high. The authority isn't getting in the way of the conversations. So you can kind of thread the needle and have both if you structure it well.
Yeah, we tend to fall on the latter. It really works for us. So basically, come kick it off, give us your feedback, give us your thoughts, your vision, then go away for a couple of hours, and then come back at the end and we'll tell you what we think we heard you say and the way we're going to do it, and then you can give us feedback. That way.
There you go. See, that's good. That's the both worlds right there.
Yeah. We have a saying in the South, your baby's ugly. And nobody wants to tell the senior vice president their project is ugly. So we got to figure out a way to think about how this baby can be more attractive maybe when they come back.
And the example I just gave where we leave the room, this is a guy who ran an engineering firm in Silicon Valley. And he said, I did this for 8 or 9 weeks. I started doing it. And I was getting so much more input from my team when I would leave my meeting for a while. He says, I did this for 8 or 9 weeks. And then he said something funny happened. One day I got up to leave my meeting and one of my engineers said, look, we talked about this as a team. You can stay if you want. You don't have to leave the meeting. And once these engineers realized, okay, he likes the pushback. He likes the feedback. He wants challenge. He wants people to throw contrarian views out there. He doesn't get defensive. He seems to kind of enjoy it. Suddenly, it's not so risky to do. So it's a good example of acting in a way that's ratcheting up the conversational capacity of a team over time. It's not like he did it just once now and went, yay, so open now. It's like a flywheel, right? I think there's this flywheel effect. And the more I'm doing it, the more I'm responding positively when someone pushes back on an idea. The more I'm responding positively, I get a contrarian perspective, the more trust that builds up and the more likely people are to say, okay, I think he might mean it. I'm going to take the risk to push back this next time. So we got to spin it up sometimes as a boss.
Right. We do that a lot too. It's basically people say, how do you implement this process? The first time is always the hardest because they don't believe you're going to do the things you say. And then once they see that you do it and you've shown you can do it, then they're more willing to trust you.
Yeah, exactly. The flywheel effect, right? I got to like it.
Yep, I like
the more
that.
I do it, the more I do it consistently and authentically, the more trust I build, the higher the conversational capacity. And then boom, you get a virtuous cycle, right? Where the more trust there is, the more people engage in the behaviors, the more they're engaged in the behaviors, the more trust there is. And see, boom, 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 off we go.
Yeah, it's so important because I knew a guy once who, when he was teaching classes, he would actually, in a very kind, nice way, saying, hey, what do he'd lead him in a certain direction. And when somebody said, yeah, I agree with that, he would just pounce on him and just pummel them because he wanted to get, like, what was the benefit in that? You made them feel bad. You've shut down all conversation. Nobody's going to say anything now. I never understood that. So I think it's important to have that trust.
Great example of someone using their authority as a sledgehammer and then wondering why won't anyone tell me when I'm about to make a bad decision? Really?
Yeah, I remember being a student at Georgia Tech in taking physics in one of the classes, and our professor had written the book at the time. And this poor girl raised her hand, and the professor just said, X equals red, let's say. And this poor girl raised her hand and says, Dr. S, the book says X is blue. And he looked at her and just, how'd you get into school? They usually let only people who can't read and they're stupid. You're clearly stupid and can't read because the book doesn't say that. And I'm looking at the book and the book says X is blue, but I'm not about to say anything at this point. Talk about minimizing. I was 100% going to minimize. I felt so bad for that girl.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's a great example of someone using their authority as a sledgehammer. Yeah.
I really enjoyed a section of your book that talked about internal commitment and joint control, the two different sections. And man, you were preaching to the choir there, because as I mentioned earlier, when we kick off a project, we have those sessions where we involve the team, and we want them to be involved even if they don't really add content, mostly because we want them to be there here, at least have heard the conversations, discuss the constraints, the risks of the project. You know, Joe wants to go left and Fred wants to go right. Why did we decide to go left in the end? And we want them we really want them to participate. And you talked about that in the book, is, you know, we would say they're having ownership of the project.
Yeah. Ownership, right? High internal commitment. I think that's right. So it's really commitment or compliance, right? What you want is commitment. You don't have people say, okay, I'm going to do this because I've been told I have to do it, whatever. Very low commitment. You get very little discretionary effort with compliance, right? So commitment, you get a lot of discretionary effort, right? So, okay, I'm going to put it, I believe in this. And what's nice about the internal commitment is that agreement with the decision isn't necessary. The two big variables are people need to respect the process by which the decision was reached. They understand it, and also they feel they were listened to. Their ideas were at least taken into account. And I've seen a lot of people say, okay, I would have gone the other direction, but I totally get why you're going this direction. Let's go. What do you need me to do? Let's hit it. And so that takes some pressure off a leader or a project manager when they realize my team does not need to agree with every decision, but they need to trust that the process I used to reach the decision was above board. And I was open to influence. I didn't come in with a pre-baked decision and just sell it to them or pretend I was being open. They had genuinely had an opportunity to influence, and they may have influenced. They may not got what they wanted exactly, but their ideas or their concerns or a risk they pointed out has been factored into the decision, so they contributed to it. And those are easier boxes to check, I think, when you're doing project management.
Yeah. We use something called group consensus, basically, to build off of that. And what that means is that if Fred wants to go left and Jane wants to, and I want to go right, let's say, and we state our case, and for whatever reason the team decides we should follow Fred left, even though you haven't changed my mind, I agree to support you in moving in what I still think is the wrong direction. So you don't necessarily change my mind, but I do understand why you're going that direction, and I'm going to help you move in that direction.
And a team with high conversational capacity, we'd see that as a big advantage in implementation, right? I like someone on the team who may not be fully enamored with the route we're taking, because they're going to be good at holding our feet to the fire. If they see a problem, if they see a risk, if they see something occurring that may be, something to worry about, they're more likely to raise their hand. So I might say to you, Clint, look, we're deciding on decision A. I know you were a really strong advocate for decision B, and you put forward a pretty cogent argument. Right heard on the implementation. If some of the problems you were concerned about crop up, raise your hand. Let's get in a room. We may need to kind of adjust course. So I actually like having someone on the team who isn't 100% bought in. They're bought into the implementation, but they're a little wary about the direction we're going. They're really good at helping us tack, right? It's like sailing, right? You never just sail straight to the point. You've often got to tack along the way. And I think decision making is like that. You're implementing a project. Things rarely go according to plan. All kinds of stuff crops up. So you want a team that can learn together really quickly, catch it when something's not working as expected, and adjust course rapidly. Having people with high conversational capacity who maybe see which way we ought to be moving and a little differently, that can be a really helpful thing in terms of catching it quickly when we need to adjust course.
Yeah, I think that we talk a lot in my work that I do about what and why. So it's I can tell you what to do, but I should also tell you why we're doing it, because if you know why, then you can add value. If you just do what, it's just labor. But if you tell me turn left, okay, I'll turn left. But if I know why we're turning left, I can say, well, there's a shortcut. If we take this if we take this not this left, but the next one, it actually is less traffic or whatever. But if I know why we're doing something, now I can involve my brain. It's not just my muscles doing the work.
Yeah, exactly right. Yes. And so I think kind of pulling that off consistently well requires high conversational capacity, right? It's hard to have those conversations and people are minimizing and not speaking up when they should, or if they're out of the sweet spot and arguing every time someone dares disagree with them. So it's really hard to have those kind of conversations and meetings. I also like your project management example because it brings up something that comes up a lot of my workshops. It's that nexus between conversational capacity and decision making. They're different things, but they're closely related. You could have a project with really good decision making protocol, but low conversational capacity. It's not going to work very well. Garbage into your decision making process, you're going to get garbage out of it. You could have a team that has high conversational capacity, but sloppy, inconsistent decision making. That isn't going to go well either. We have really good conversations, They don't go anywhere. There's no process by which you can take those conversations and translate them into a decision. So you kind of need both. So what you want is really clear decision-making protocol. I know who's making a decision. I know who needs to be involved. I know how much time we're going to spend on it, et cetera. And in that, to feed into that, we need the high conversational capacity. So they're different things, but they're closely related, and that comes up a lot.
Yeah, for sure. As I read the book, I kept thinking, oh, I'm glad I did this right. I'm glad I did this right. And then I read another section of the book where it says my brain might be tricking me to think I'm doing it right, but I'm really not.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So in my mind, I'm in the sweet spot, but maybe I'm really not in the sweet spot.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Feeling like you're in the sweet spot and actually being in the sweet spot are often two different things, right? Exactly.
Absolutely. As we wrap this up, are there any memorable stories from the work you've done with organizations that really illustrate this transformative impact of building conversational capacity? You can hide the names, of course.
Yeah. Boy, so many. It's hard to think of one. One of my new favorites is just a couple of years ago, I did a virtual workshop, and one of the members said, hey, can we do a Zoom meeting? This is 3 weeks after the session. I'd like to do a Zoom meeting with you. I want to give you some feedback. And I thought, okay, am I in trouble? He said, no, it's positive. I said, okay, great, then I'll do it. So we actually got on a Zoom call, and he said, when you spoke, you said, nothing lowers conversational capacity more predictably than the presence of authority. And I thought, uh-oh. And he said, why have smart people around the table if you're not going to use their smarts? And he went, uh-oh. He said, I have a lot of authority. He said, I'm from New Jersey originally, so I got this really strong kind of East Coast wind tendency. And he said, I'm a big guy physically. I'm a big dude. So I'm like Tony Soprano, he said, running this place, scaring the daylights out of everybody. So I'm not going to sell my company and I'm not going to change my physical size, but I can take a lot more responsibility for that wind tendency. That's a variable I can do something about. So he said, my number one takeaway was the trigger journal. I got to get better at, catching it when my need to win is getting triggered. And so he said, for the last 3 weeks in the workplace, I've been doing it religiously. I've been really, really seriously, systematically paying attention. After just 3 weeks of doing this, he said, I just got some feedback that it was clearly having a big effect on my behavior. And he said, the funny thing is, it wasn't from someone in the workplace where I was putting in all the practice. It was from my wife at home. I hadn't told her a thing about this. I wasn't even paying attention to this at home. But he said the other night at dinner, she set down her wine glass and said, look, I'm just going to come out and ask you, did you have a stroke? Are you having an affair? What is going on with you lately? Yeah. So she was seeing a big shift in his behavior. He wasn't as emotionally reactive. He wasn't flying off the handle with her and the kids like he had. But initially, at least until she understood why, she wasn't taking it as fully positive. But I think he said that really caught me by surprise. I wasn't even paying attention to this at home, but it was obviously having a bleed over effect. So it kind of goes back to that conversation we had earlier about how do we create a workplace dynamic that is good for people, good for the business, and good for the community. And I think that's a good example of how I can put in practice in the workplace, but it's going to make me better with my family. It's going to make me better in my community. It's going to make me better wherever else I need to engage with people around issues that really matter. And I think that's a workplace worth cultivating.
Yeah, for sure. What a great story to end this up on. So I got 3 questions left. I asked the same 3 questions of everybody. Are there any leadership principles that speak to you personally and guide your day-to-day behaviors?
Boy, there are quite a few. I'll give you one of my favorites. Yes to the mess. So a good friend of mine, Frank Barrett, he wrote a book called Yes to the Mess, Surprising Leadership Lessons from Jazz. And he talks about how jazz musicians embrace error. They embrace mistakes. They embrace surprises. That's where the learning tends to occur. And I found whether it's in my role as a father, whether it's in my role, as a consultant or a speaker, that yes to the mess attitude is a really powerful thing. So don't look at everything. Something goes sideways. Don't just look at like, oh, woe is me. Say, okay, maybe there's an opportunity here. This might actually provide something interesting. So to me, that's one of the big ones that I find has an increasingly powerful role in how I try to engage myself, personally and professionally.
I'm adding that one to my to-do list then. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Oh, boy. Wow. That's a tough one. I'd have to really noodle that one over. I've been given, as somebody who needed a lot of advice through his life, I've gotten a lot of advice. So the best one, that'd be a really tough one. A really good one, I'll just say this one. M. Scott Peck on The Road Less Traveled. I mentioned him earlier. One of the things he talks about is life is a series of problems. And if you want to get good at solving problems, you need to build your discipline. So it's hard to solve problems. You don't have the discipline. And so I like the idea of looking at, building your discipline. That can be physical discipline. I like to trail run. I like to push myself hard. It can be intellectual discipline. I want to make sure I'm, strengthening my mind's ability to make sense of the world around it in an increasingly effective way. It could be emotional discipline. And so I think this idea of how do we start building our discipline if we want to really engage with the world in a more effective way. So that's a piece of advice that served me well ever since I read the book, 35, 40 years ago.
Well, speaking of books, that's a segue into my last one, which is what's the best book or article you've read recently, and what was the key takeaway?
I've been rereading a book by my mentor and a colleague and the person who inspired me to do the kind of the work I'm doing, Dean Williams. And he wrote a book called Real Leadership, which really looks at the difference between authority and leadership. He's a colleague of Ron Heifetz at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and their work around adaptive leadership. So that book, every time I come back to it, he's got two books. His books, Leadership for a Fractured World is the second book. I've been revisiting those recently, and those are two profound books that really help you think about what does leadership look like in a complex, messy world. Also, his work dovetails nicely with Frank Barrett's work, Yes to the Mess, and with the Conversational Capacity framework. So that'd be one I'm jazzed about right now. And just had lunch with Dean here a week and a half ago, so I haven't seen him for a while. So we got together and had lunch here, so that was fun too.
That's awesome. So I really appreciate you being here today, Craig, and I really enjoy talking to you about conversational capacity. If people want to get in touch with you or learn more about what you do in your company and your books, how can they do that?
The books are easy to find. McGraw-Hill published both, so Amazon. Conversationalcapacity.com. The website has a lot of information about the framework, about the books, about workshops, speaking, etc. As well as what I call the dojo. It just has a curated list of articles related to conversational capacity in those three buckets: awareness, mindset, and skill set. And then I'm active on LinkedIn, publishing things from time to time relative to this. So that's an easy way to connect with me as well and to stay connected.
Craig, thanks so much for the conversation.
That was a lot of fun, Clint. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.